During my research into Cniva's campaign, I came across 3 theories that I found pretty interesting, and I thought it'd be cool to share them with you guys. Oh, and by the way, the first theory is kind of like a debate. There's going to be 3 mini theories inside of it. Alright, theory number 1. The road the Goths took to go back home. Like I said in the previous video, we don't know for sure what road Cniva took to bring his Goths back home. There are at least 3 theories to explain the road Cniva might have chosen to navigate the Roman territory. And just so we're clear, those 3 theories are still part of the first theory. The first theory claims that the Gothic army marched towards Seldzica, located northwest of Philippopolis, allowing them to circumvent the Hemus Mountains by the west, and then followed the Roman road east until they reached Ebritus in Moesia. But I don't personally buy into it. Just think about it. By heading west, Cniva would be heading towards the center of the empire, and would therefore get closer to potential Roman reinforcements from other parts of the border. It would be a huge risk to take, considering there were other roads further east where they had less chances to face new troops. So now for the second theory, and we're still talking about the first theory by the way. Theory number 2 states that Cniva simply would have decided to take the same road he took the previous year. That means he would have retraced the steps from the previous year. They claim they would have passed by Beroe, the Shipka Pass, and then Nicopolis, but then decided to head towards Ebritus in the northeast. Personally, I don't buy that one either. Cause if Cniva was following the same path he took the previous year, he would have started heading towards Oescus in the northwest after reaching Nicopolis. But instead, Cniva led the Goths towards Ebritus in the northeast. If the plan really was for them to retrace their steps, why would Cniva take such a long detour? He was right by the Danube, not far away from Oescus, where he and his men had crossed the river the previous year. It would have been way simpler for whoever helped him cross the Danube the previous year to wait for him and his men around Oescus. Another thing that makes me doubt this theory is that the Romans could have easily laid a trap or an ambush in the Hemus Mountains. So would have Cniva really taken the risk to pass through them again? We gotta keep in mind that armies are vulnerable when they're on the move, and a small mountain path could allow a small and well-organized Roman force to attack the Goths, who wouldn't have the necessary space to mount a proper defense. Such a scenario could probably annihilate the Gothic army, and even if the Romans hadn't prepared an ambush, a small group of soldiers could have built and manned a fortress to block off the path that goes through the Hemus Mountains. And once Cniva and his men are on a small mountain path and they find a fortress blocking their way, another group of Romans could have moved quickly to set up another fortress and block their way back to Thrace. The Gothic army would then be trapped in a mountain and could slowly be starved by the Romans before finishing them off. Not only that, there's also the fact that the Goths were an army of raiders, so taking the same path as last year means going back to the same places they already pillaged. But I have to admit, that's a lot of ifs and maybes on my part. But put yourself in Cniva's shoes for a moment. Are those risks you'd be willing to take? Cause I wouldn't be willing to take them. I would prefer to take another path that gives me enough room to maneuver my armies and that leads me further away from the center of the empire and potential enemy reinforcement. Which leads us to theory number 3. The third theory states that Cniva would have led his Goths east of Philippopolis and would have kept raiding the eastern parts of Thrace at the same time. Then they would eventually head north to pass the Hemus Mountains by the east. And once they would have circumvented the mountains by the east, they would head northwest towards the Danube River, which would eventually lead them to the areas around Ebritus where they faced Decius' forces. I tend to agree with this version of events for many reasons. First of all, Argafe and Gunteric already had prior knowledge of the area, since they'd already marched through these parts of Thrace and Moesia the previous year with their 20,000 troops. So Cniva could ask them to safely lead the way, which is a huge help when you're deep in enemy territory. Now for the second reason why I like this theory. Contrary to the first theory, which states that Cniva would have passed through Seldzica, Cniva would not only be heading further away from the center of the empire, he would also head further away from possible enemy reinforcement that could be redeployed towards him. I'm guessing at this point, Cniva was hoping he could cross the Danube without facing any Roman opposition. Let's use bank robbers as an example. Once they've done their bank robbery, and they have the money, they'll do whatever they can to stay away from the police while they're going back to their safe house. They already have the money. Running into the cops would risk them losing everything they've worked for. And it's the same thing for an army of raiders and pillagers. The Goths already have the booty and slaves they wanted, so they would risk losing everything by getting into a fight with the Romans. We must also understand that the Gothic army was weighted down by all the loot they were bringing home with them. That means the movement of their army would be slowed down, which would be a huge disadvantage if they were to meet a Roman army. It would also slow down their soldiers, who could flat out refuse to abandon their spoils of war, allowing any Roman cavalry to easily catch up with them if the Goths had to flee. And for those who don't believe someone could put gold, silver, or any material wealth before their own lives, go play the Dead Muddy DLC for Fallout New Vegas. When you eventually come face to face with the most wealth you've ever seen in the game, you'll try to take it all with you, it will slow you down, and you will die because of your own greed. And I know this for a fact, because we all did the same thing. So why would we expect anything different from the Goths? They spent the whole winter pillaging Thrace. They left their homes for a whole year. Their luggages were probably filled with more wealth than they've ever seen in their entire lives. So do you guys really think the barbarians would be ready to just throw it all away? No, they would risk their lives to try and keep it. And finally, the third reason why I agree with the theory that Cniva circumvented the Hemus Mountains by the east. Look at where Abritus is located on the map. Like I said earlier, Abritus would have been a massive detour if the Goths would have marched through the Shipka Pass, or if they would have passed by Seldzika in the west. But, if Cniva instead decided to follow the path Argaith and Gunteric took the previous year, then Abritus is basically in a straight line towards the Danube River. And keep in mind the example I mentioned earlier about the bank robbers. Why would they make such a long detour to pass by Abritus? Anyone would have preferred going back home as fast as possible, away from the Roman armies looking to kill them and take back their spoils of war. If they would have passed by the Shipka Pass or by Seldzika, then Novae would have been a better place to cross the Danube. But, if they did circumvent by the east, Novae becomes a massive detour, and Abritus becomes a logical choice for a group who wants to cross the Danube as fast as possible. Now, I know I've said a raiding army would probably prefer passing through a place that hasn't been raided yet. After all, it was one of the reasons why I doubted they'd go back to the Shipka Pass. The reason why I don't think it will bother them that much this time is because only about 20,000 men walked through the area east of the Hemus Mountains the previous year. So maybe they didn't have the manpower or time to raid as much as they could have. Meaning there could still be enough loot in the area to justify going back. But I don't think looting was the main factor that pushed Cniva to circumvent by the east, since they already had tons of spoils already. But I'm sure it was a nice little bonus. But as far as I'm concerned, getting away from possible reinforcement and getting back into Germania as fast as possible were the big reasons why they headed east. And those are all the reasons why I personally believe that Cniva decided to lead his men east of the Hemus Mountains in the spring of 251. But I'm not a historian, so take my opinions with a grain of salt because I could have missed something. Moving on to theory number 2. This one could be considered a mini-theory. Lily Grozdanova underlines something important in her book on the conflict between the Romans and the Goths. It is generally accepted that the Goths and Cniva spend their winter in Philippopolis, but she points out that the ancient sources don't specify exactly where they spend their winter. She also points out that it's modern historians who claim the Goths spend the winter in Thrace. Lily Grozdanova also tells us that the ancient sources claim the Goths destroyed Philippopolis, massacred its population, and enslaved the survivors. So Lily asks the question, would the Gothic army really spend the winter in a ruined city full of rotting human corpses? And when you say it like that, it becomes obvious why she says something doesn't add up. If the Goths did in fact spend the winter months in Philippopolis, then what did they do to make sure the army wouldn't get sick? Sure, Cniva could have ordered his boys to bury the dead Romans, or he could have ordered the slaves to do it, but he would have needed to order his men to watch over the slaves 24/7. So butchering the population and staying in Philippopolis would have slowed down the pillaging of Thrace. Not only that, but if the city really would have been destroyed, then the Goths would have been exposed to the winter cold, and constantly being exposed to the cold winter nights means risking the chance of getting sick or dying from the cold. Now, I don't know the average temperatures in Thrace back in the days, but I do know that nowadays in Bulgaria, the average winter temperatures are in the slight negative Celsius. So I'm assuming the nights could get quite cold back in the days. And damaged buildings don't offer the best isolation. So that was a resume of Lily Grozdanova's reasoning. Sadly, her book is mostly in Bulgarian, so I can't explore her reasoning in its entirety. But from what I understood, she doesn't believe the Gothic army actually spent the winter in Philippopolis. She even seems to doubt that Cniva and his men spent the winter in Thrace. But again, I can't confirm this 100%. It's just what I understood from the resume section in English. And now, we finally reached our last theory. Theory number 3. Our last theory comes from Ilkka Syvänne, and it talks about the composition of Cniva's army. Historians have a tendency of revising downward the amount of soldiers that barbarian armies had. They say the victorious Roman generals liked inflating the numbers of barbarians they managed to fight back to aggrandize their exploits and to look even more like badasses. But Syvänne agrees with the amount of soldiers ancient sources say Cniva was leading, and goes one step further. He believes that Cniva was leading an army that was mostly composed of cavalry. Syvänne uses different sources, like Maurice's Strategicon and the Byzantine author George Syncellus, to come up with this theory. According to Syncellus, the Goths surrounded the Moesians who were trying to flee towards Nicopolis at Istrum. Syvänne interprets this as a form of tactical encirclement used by the Sarmathian nomads from the steppes during their large-scale hunts. Syvänne also says the strategies used by the Goths leads him to believe that the Goths also had a great number of horsemen. Take for example the swift attack the Goths launched on the Roman camp around Beroe. A large cavalry would have allowed the Goths to quickly swarm the Roman camp and to prevent the Romans from organizing any form of defense. Such a scenario would explain why Decius' army was annihilated so quickly and why Decius himself barely made it out of there. A large portion of horsemen also explains how Cniva was able to send 2 different divisions attack the Romans at Abritus, only to have them safely retreat. If Cniva would have made the same plan but with infantry, the Roman cavalry could have easily caught up with them during their false retreat and wiped them out. If this was the case, Cniva would have sent his men to their death, and we know that after the Battle of Abritus, the Goths were too numerous for the Romans to oppose them. So it confirms to us that the Gothic losses were minimal. Not only that, but barbarian warriors only follow commanders out of their own free will. When a barbarian leader was defeated in battle, he would lose the confidence of his men, and they would flat out pack their things and leave. So I honestly doubt the Goths would agree to risk their lives by doing false retreats on foot, when they could instead stay hidden and lay an ambush. Horses gave the Gothic troops a greater speed and mobility compared to the Roman infantry, allowing them to retreat without too much fear or risk, making the maneuver far more reasonable and doable for the Goths. Syvänne explains the reason the Goths had so many horses at their disposal was because after the Goths migrated to western Scythia, they had adopted many Sarmathian practices and customs. The western part of Scythia, where the Goths had moved to, was located on the Pontic steppe, a sea of grass and open plains that goes on for days and weeks. The steppe was populated by nomadic tribes called the Sarmathians, who to my knowledge fought exclusively on horseback and used a lot of horse archers. So to be able to survive this harsh and hostile environment and be capable of fighting off the other nomadic tribes, the Goths had to adopt many of the Sarmathian customs, strategies, and tactics. At this point, Ilkka Syvänne claims the Goths had become Sarmathianized during their stay in Scythia, and that they could no longer be seen as purely Germanic. Syvänne explains his reasoning by pointing out the fact that the Goths had taken in many Sarmathians and Alans, and that it was these new members who would have taught the Goths how to fight on horseback like the nomads, and how to use the chariots to not only move around, but also to use them for defensive purposes by turning them into small mobile fortresses we call wagon forts. According to Syvänne, their stay in Scythia would have not only changed the way the Goths waged war, but it would have also changed the way their homes were built, and maybe even how their communities were organized. Now, before ending Syvänne's theory, I wanted to add a little something I thought of when I was writing this video. The steppe nomads were used to spending the winters in tents made out of thick felt, called yurts, or gers, ger, or however it's pronounced. So if Syvänne was right, and the Goths were in fact Sarmathianized, it could help explain Lily Grozdanova's doubts that I mentioned in theory number 2. If the Goths were used to live in yurts, and they did in fact destroy Philippopolis, then they could have comfortably waited out the winter months in their cozy yurts. But that's just an idea I had while writing this video. I'm not saying it's true, or that's how it happened. It's just a little something I thought of, that I found interesting, and I wanted to share it with you guys. And those were our 3 theories on Cniva's campaign into the Roman Empire. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It took a little longer to make because I was having recording issues. I had to re-record about half of it. Maybe you guys will notice the changes in the audio quality. Please leave a comment to tell me what you thought of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed my videos. For the next couple of videos, I'm planning on taking a little break from the Goths, and I want to talk about the Gracchi brothers. But I still want to go back to the Goths eventually, because I want to eventually make it all the way to 410.